Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty ambitious, I'd say.
Definitely. It's a unique challenge.
We're looking at a very specific, biblically based timeline of end times events. I mean, detailed right down to the start of eternity.
Yeah, the source we're using, this document called Brief Chronology of the Apocalypse, it lays out a really precise sequence, dates, calculations, the whole thing.
Exactly. And our mission really is to unpack all of that for you. We're going beyond the sort of general ideas you might hear.
Right, into specific dates, what the symbols might mean according to this source, some connections that, frankly, are quite surprising.
Yeah, surprising is a good word. We want to give you a kind of shortcut through this complex material, hopefully without making your head spin too much.
Well, it's certainly unique the way it weaves together different Bible passages and these, well, mathematical interpretations to actually project future events. It's very specific.
It really is. And it immediately brings up that big question, doesn't it?
Hmm.
Can we actually know the timeline for things like this? Events so monumental.
That's the core question, I think. This document, it takes a stab at it.
So where does it start? The document uses a historical anchor point.
Right. It begins with Jerusalem's destruction by the Romans back in the mid-70s AD.
Okay, historical fact. But then it makes this leap, connecting it to a prophecy in Isaiah.
Yeah, Isaiah 60, verse 3. The interpretation here is that Jerusalem becomes the new world capital around 2070 AD during the Millennium.
Which would be exactly 2,000 years after its destruction. Interesting symmetry there.
It is, and from that point, it shifts focus to Jesus' own words in Matthew 24 about the signs before his return.
Ah, yes, the Olivet Discourse.
Yeah.
Very significant passage.
Crucial, and this is where the source gets into the idea of generations. Matthew 24.34, Jesus says, that generation would not pass away until all these things had been fulfilled.
But the question is always which generation?
Exactly. And this document has a specific answer. It argues it's the generation that lives through the specific signs Jesus mentioned. Things like nation rising against nation.
Like
Yeah,
World War I.
precisely. The source identifies World War I and also World War II, particularly highlighting the persecution of the Jewish people during that time as key markers for this generation.
Okay, so if that's the generation, how long is a generation according to this source?
It pulls from Genesis 6.3, interpreting God setting man's days at 120 years as defining the length of this specific prophetic generation.
So let's do the math then. If World War I is the starting point, 1914, and a generation is 120 years, then Christ's return, according to this document, has to happen before that generation ends.
Right, so 1914 plus 120 years.
That lands us squarely before 2034. That's the first major date projection we get.
It is, and the source tries to build support for this 2034 date with another layer of interpretation, this time involving symbolism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the symbol?
It goes back to the Israelites crossing the Jordan River. Joshua 3.4 says they had to keep a distance of 2,000 cubits from the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, I remember that, 2,000 cubits.
So the document interprets the Ark, especially the mercy seat on top, as a symbol for Jesus.
Okay, that's a common interpretation.
And the Jordan River itself, it argues, represents death and resurrection. It even points to the Hebrew root word yarden, meaning the one who descends.
Descending into death, rising into new life. Makes sense. But how does the 2,000 cubits fit in?
This is where it gets interesting. The source looks at Matthew 6.27, where Jesus talks about adding a cubit to one's stature or lifespan, depending on the translation.
Ah, the cannot add one cubit unto his stature verse.
Yes. The source argues strongly that a cubit can measure time, not just length. It even suggests the King James translation might be slightly off here,
Oh,
arguing that Jesus wouldn't make illogical statements and his disciples recorded accurately. So the implication is a cubit must be able to measure time in some context.
okay, that's a bold claim about translation, but following their logic, if a cubit can measure time.
Then 2,000 cubits become 2,000 years.
Ah, so a 2,000-year gap. Between what?
Between Christ's death, which the source places around 34 AD, and the symbolic death of his people during the Great Tribulation. That's when they metaphorically descend into the Jordan before reaching the new earth.
So 34 AD plus 2,000 years.
Lands you right back at 2034 AD. It connects perfectly with the generation calculation.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
That's neat. The internal consistency is striking there.
It also mentions the 12 stones left in the Jordan from Joshua 4, interpreting those as signifying dying to the old life right as they enter the new reality. It all points back to that 2034 time frame.
Okay, so 2034 is looking like a really central pin in this timeline. What comes next? The document introduces another time unit, right?
Yes, a core concept it uses is time, times, and half a time. You see that in Daniel and Revelation.
Commonly interpreted as 3.5 years.
Correct, and this source explicitly calls that period a prophetic day.
A prophetic day equals 3.5 literal years. Got it.
And this prophetic day then becomes the measure for laying out the sequence leading up to the Great Tribulation. It gets quite detailed.
Okay, like what?
Well, for instance, it takes the day Israel crossed the Jordan, the 10th day of the first month in Joshua 4.19, and says that represents the 12,290 days, or the 3.5 years, just before the Great Tribulation begins.
Okay, so one prophetic day leads right into it?
Exactly. And then, remember the story, they waited 4 days before marching around Jericho?
Yeah.
The source interprets those 4 days as symbolizing a period of 13 or maybe 14 years of peace that happens before something called the period of the trumpets.
Interesting. 4 days become 13 or 14 years. There's a lot of symbolic math here.
There really is. It's consistent within its own framework, but you have to follow the logic step by step.
So before the trumpets, there's this peace period. The source adds another detail here about building a temple.
Yes, it draws a parallel with Solomon's temple, which took over 7 years to build. It suggests the Lord should have spent a similar time building his spiritual temple in Israel.
Okay.
But identifies the building materials, in this case, as Catholic clergy and monks. It's a very specific interpretation.
That is specific. And it says there's not much time left for that phase.
Right. It claims only 3 or 4 years remain before the 5th seal is opened, which seems to trigger the next major phase in their timeline.
And after the Great Tribulation itself, what happens then?
According to this chronology, there's another period of peace, likely 13 years.
Why 13 years specifically?
It connects it back to Solomon again. After Solomon finished the temple, he took 13 years to build his own palace. The source points to Hebrews 3.6, identifying this house not as a palace, but as the church.
So 13 years of peace after the tribulation for the church to be established or rebuilt in a sense.
Yeah, that seems to be the idea. And this 13-year period is also when the 144,000 come into play.
Ah, the 144,000 from Revelation. How do they fit in?
The source posits they are conceived during the Great Tribulation. It describes it starkly, Jerusalem being overrun, women violated, linking this to the abomination of desolation.
That's a grim connection.
It is. But from that horror, the 144,000 are born, and they are then sealed at age 12, coinciding with their bar mitzvah during the subsequent 13-year peace period.
Okay, so tribulation, then a 13-year peace where the 144,000 mature and are sealed. What follows the peace?
Then we get to the 7th seal, which unleashes the 7 trumpets.
Right, and each trumpet blast signifies major events or judgments.
And according to this document, each of those 7 trumpets lasts for 1 prophetic day.
Meaning 3.5 years each.
Correct. It also specifies that the 7 boldevests of God's wrath are actually contained within the final 7th trumpet.
Okay, nested judgments.
And importantly, it highlights Revelation 10, where the angel swears there will be no more delay. So the 7th trumpet begins immediately after the 6th, impacting all cities, globally, not just Jerusalem.
No pause before the final phase of judgment.
Exactly. Now, putting all these pieces together, the 2034 date, the peace period, the trumpets allows the source to calculate the start of the millennium.
Okay, let's walk through that calculation.
You start with 2034, the projected year for Christ's return. Add the 13 years of initial peace.
Okay, 2047.
Then add the duration of the 7 trumpets. That's 7 times 3.5 years, which is 24.5 years.
So 2047 plus 24.5 takes us to 2071.5.
Almost. There's one adjustment. The source subtracts 1 year, citing a kind of grace period or delay related to the final trumpet starting immediately. So minus 1 year.
Brings us to 2070.5, mid-2070.
Exactly. And that's a projected start of the millennium, which, ironically,
is 2,000 years after Jerusalem was destroyed back in 70 AD. It circles back.
Precisely. The symmetry is clearly important in this interpretation.
So we've got 2034 for the return, 2070.5 for the millennium. But this document goes even further, doesn't it? It talks about a grander prophetic year.
It does. It frames a much larger time scale, suggesting this prophetic year framework actually began way back with Jesus' birth.
How does that work?
It goes back to the Jordan crossing again, Joshua 4.1, the 10th day of the first month. It interprets this date as symbolically marking both the start and the end of Jesus' ministry, which it takes as 3.5 years long.
How does 10 days relate to 3.5 years?
The math here is 10 days times 3.5 years per prophetic day unit, apparently linking to Jesus being 35 years old. It's another symbolic calculation.
Okay, I think I'm following the pattern of symbolic calculation here.
Yeah.
And the 2,000 cubits fit into this larger picture too.
Yes, that 2,000 cubits representing 2,000 years of separation is a recurring theme within this larger prophetic year structure as well.
It seems incredibly complex internally. Does it all add up?
Well, the source claims remarkable internal consistency, but it involves some, let's say, intricate adjustments to make it work.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, remember the periods leading up to the millennium? The 10 days for the Jordan crossing symbol, the 4 days before Jericho, and the 7 trumpets. That's 21 prophetic days in total?
Right. 21 times 3.5 years should be 73.5 years.
Correct. But the source adjusts this. It subtracts 1 year from the very beginning, kind of before the clock starts, and another year from the end, claiming the last trumpet is actually only 2.5 years, not 3.5.
Why the adjust?
To make the final calculation land precisely on 2070.5 when added to the 2,000 years from 34 AD. It's about achieving that perfect numerical alignment.
So the numbers are massaged slightly to maintain the overall consistency. Are there other examples like that?
Yes, quite a few. For instance, the millennium itself. The source calculates it as 286 prophetic days.
Okay, 286 times 3.5 years.
That's 1,001 years, not exactly 1,000.
Ah, so there's an extra year.
And the source says that extra year precisely balances out the year that was missing from the final trumpet calculation. It creates this internal balance.
I see. And the 4 days of rest before Jericho, you said 13 or 14 years earlier.
Right. The source clarifies it equals 14 years, 4 by 3.5 equals 14. Not the 13 years of peace after the tribulation, because it argues the first year of the first trumpet period gets added to those 13 years of peace somehow. It's complex.
It really is weaving a tight, if complicated, tapestry. What happens after all these main events, after the millennium?
Well, after the 1,000 years, or 1,001 by that calculation, the timeline continues. The source points to Revelation 20, where Satan is released from the abyss.
Right, released for a short time to deceive the nations.
Exactly. And the document says he deceives the nations, specifically identifying Gog and Magog with Russia to attack Israel one last time.
And when does this final attack happen?
On a very specific date, the 14th day of the last prophetic month, which corresponds to the Jewish festival of Purim.
Purim, the feast celebrating deliverance. That's ironic.
Highly ironic.
Yeah.
But the attack fails catastrophically. God intervenes directly with fire from heaven, destroying Israel's enemies.
Does the source give a time frame for how long Satan have to gather these forces after the millennium?
Yes, it emphasizes God's patience, even with the devil. It says Satan has at least one full prophetic month, which translates to over 100 years to rally his forces and build weapons, referencing Ezekiel 38.
Over a century for this final rebellion to build.
That's the idea. It connects this time frame back to the generation concept, too. 34 prophetic days equal 119 years, roughly one generation.
So this Purim battle happens about 120 years after the millennium ends.
Approximately, yes. Again, aligning with that 120-year limit from Genesis 6.3, applied now to this final period of rebellion.
The source also mentions something about life during the millennium, citing Isaiah.
Isaiah 65.2. It interprets this to mean that during the millennium, anyone dying at 100 would be considered cursed, like a sinner cut off early, while reaching 100 would be like, well, just reaching adulthood, a baseline.
Longer lifespans, but mortality and sin still exist, it seems. So after the Purim battle, what brings us to eternity itself?
The final calculations involve that Purim period. The source mentions 2 prophetic days related to Purim, plus another 2 weeks, 14 prophetic days. Added together, that's 49 prophetic days.
49. Like the years in a Jubilee cycle.
Precisely. It represents the final Jubilee period leading into eternity.
So let's put it all together. Millennium starts mid-2070, which is Hebrew year 5830.
Correct. Add 1,000 years for the millennium itself.
68830.
Add 120 years for the post-millennium rebellion and Purim period.
6950.
Add the 49 years for the final Jubilee.
61099.
And then add one final year, the first year of eternity itself.
Takes us to exactly 7,000 years from the source's calculation of creation.
Yes, tying it directly to the 7 days of creation, citing Psalm 90, verse 4. 1,000 years in your sight are like a day. So day 7 ends, and the eternal day 8, or year 7001, technically begins after year 7000 is complete.
7,000 years. That's a very potent number biblically.
It is. The source also notes that the start of the millennium, Hebrew year 5830, is roughly the 119th Jubilee since creation. 5 out at 830 divided by 49.
And it connects that to God not tolerating humanity beyond 120 Jubilees, another link to Genesis 6.3.
Exactly. It keeps circling back to these core numbers and concepts.
There was one more date mentioned, 3240 AD. How does that fit in?
Ah, right. The source identifies this whole grand prophetic year from Jesus' birth onwards as the acceptable year of the Lord mentioned in Luke 4.19. And it calculates this year or era extends all the way to 3240 AD. That's derived from 2070, start of Millennium, plus 1000, Millennium, plus 120, Rebellion, plus 50, the Jubilee period, rounding the 49 up.
Which also happens to be 66 Jubilees from some point. It's densely packed.
Very densely packed. But the final crucial point the source makes addresses the obvious objection. If we have all these dates, 2034, 2070, even 7000, doesn't that contradict Jesus saying no one knows the day or the hour?
The big one. How does the source handle that?
It draws a distinction. It argues Jesus specifically restricted knowledge of the day and the hour. Matthew 24.36, Mark 13.32, they emphasize day and hour.
Okay.
But the source claims this restriction doesn't apply to knowing the year or maybe even the month. That knowledge, it suggests, wasn't meant for the early disciples.
But it is meant for?
For us, that's the direct quote. Because, as the source puts it, we are truly the ones who are going to live through it, and all of this is on the verge of beginning to happen.
Wow. That's quite a claim to conclude with, that this detailed knowledge is specifically for people living now.
It certainly positions the entire chronology as immediately relevant.
So just to recap the major points we've covered from this source.
Yeah.
A projected 2034 for Christ's return based on generations and symbolic cubits. The millennium starting around mid-2070, 2,000 years after Jerusalem's fall, and this all culminating in the year 7000 from creation marking eternity's dawn. It's an incredibly specific roadmap.
It truly is a detailed, biblically derived timeline laid out step by step in the brief chronology of the apocalypse.
It leaves you with a lot to think about.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener. Given these meticulous calculations, these symbolic interpretations we've just walked through, how might contemplating such a detailed timeline shift your own perspective, maybe about the world around you, or even how you think about time itself?
That's a deep question to ponder. We really encourage you to think back on the connections made today, the generations, the cubits, the prophetic days, the jubilees. What parts of this intricate structure stood out most to you? It's certainly given us plenty to discuss.